The bell above the door jingled softly as Emily stepped into the small, quiet doctor's office. Her sneakers squeaked faintly against the tiled floor, drawing the attention of the receptionist seated behind the counter. The woman looked up with a polite smile but quickly frowned when she noticed the girl's appearance. Emily was thin, almost too thin, and her oversized hoodie hung loosely on her frame, doing little to hide the bruises peeking out from under the fabric. Her hair was tied back messily, strands falling across her face as if she hadn't bothered to fix it properly. Most striking, though, were her eyes, wide, wary, and filled with a mix of fear and determination. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked gently, trying not to stare at the marks on Emily's arms. Emily hesitated for a moment, clutching a crumpled piece of paper tightly in her hand. She glanced around the room, taking in the neatly arranged chairs, the potted plant in the corner, and the framed medical degrees hanging on the wall. It all felt so normal, so safe, compared to what she had left behind. Finally, she nodded and said in a voice barely louder than a whisper, "I need to see Dr. Reynolds." The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Emily admitted, shifting uncomfortably. "But it's important. Please." Something in her tone must have struck a chord because the receptionist picked up the phone and dialed an extension. After a brief conversation, she gestured toward the hallway. "Go ahead. His office is the second door on the right." Emily swallowed hard and made her way down the corridor, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached the door, she paused, staring at the nameplate that read, Dr. Mark Reynolds. For a moment, she wondered if she was making a mistake. What if he didn't believe her? What if he turned her away? But then she remembered the pain she'd endured, the nights spent crying herself to sleep, and the promise she'd made to herself. No more running, no more hiding. She knocked lightly, and a warm, inviting voice called out, "Come in." Pushing the door open, Emily found herself face to face with a man who looked both familiar and completely foreign. He was in his late 40s, with graying hair and kind brown eyes that seemed to radiate compassion. He sat behind a cluttered desk holding a clipboard but put it down immediately when he saw her standing there. "Hello," he said with a gentle smile. "How can I help you today?" Emily took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to speak, to explain everything, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she held out the crumpled piece of paper she'd been gripping since she arrived. It was a faded photograph, one she'd found among her mother's belongings after her death. In it, a younger version of the man before her stood beside a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Emily herself. This is me," Emily stammered, pointing to the picture. "And you're my father." For a split second, the room fell silent. Dr. Reynolds stared at the photo, then at the girl standing in front of him. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and finally to something raw and unfiltered, pain. Tears welled up in his eyes as he slumped back in his chair, covering his mouth with one hand. "Emily," he whispered hoarsely, somehow knowing her name without asking. Oh my God. In that single moment, the walls Emily had built around herself began to crack. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a victim, not as a burden, but as someone worthy of love. And for Mark, the weight of 20 missed years crashed down on him like a tidal wave, leaving him breathless and broken. Neither of them knew what would come next, but one thing was certain. Their lives would never be the same again. Dr. Mark Reynolds sat frozen in his chair, the photograph trembling slightly in his hands. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what Emily had just said. The girl standing before him, bruised, fragile, yet somehow strong, was claiming to be his daughter, a daughter he never knew existed. He stared at the picture again, recognizing the young woman beside him in the faded image. It was Sarah, the woman he'd fallen in love with during a brief summer romance decades ago. They'd parted ways amicably when their lives took different paths, but she'd never mentioned being pregnant. "Sarah, she's your mother?" Mark asked softly, his voice thick with emotion. Emily nodded, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her hoodie. "She passed away 6 months ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before she died, I found some letters she wrote to you. She told me everything." Mark leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk as he struggled to process the revelation. "Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she reach out?" Emily hesitated, glancing down at her hands. "She said it wasn't safe. She thought someone might hurt us if they knew about you. That's why we moved around so much when I was little. She wanted to keep me safe." The pieces began falling into place for Mark. Sarah's sudden disappearance all those years ago hadn't been indifference. It had been fear. Fear for her child. Guilt washed over him as he realized how many moments he'd missed, how many birthdays, milestones, and memories he hadn't been there for. But something else gnawed at him too. The bruises on Emily's arms, the haunted look in her eyes. Something terrible had happened to her, and he needed to know what. "Emily," he said carefully, choosing his words with care. "Can you tell me more about your life after Sarah? Who took care of you after she passed away?" Emily stiffened, her jaw tightening as she fought back tears. She looked away, focusing on a spot on the wall behind him. For a long moment she didn't speak, and Mark wondered if he'd pushed too hard. Then finally she exhaled shakily and began to talk. "My mom remarried when I was 5, she said quietly. Her husband, he wasn't nice. At first it was just yelling. He'd get angry over small things and scream at both of us, but then..." Her voice cracked and she paused, swallowing hard. "Then it got worse. After Mom died, it was like he didn't have anyone else to take it out on. He started hitting me." Mark felt his stomach churn, anger bubbling beneath the surface. How could anyone harm a child? And not just any child. His child. He clenched his fists under the desk, forcing himself to stay calm. Now wasn't the time to let his emotions take over. Emily needed him to listen, not react. "I tried to leave once," she continued, her voice steadier now. "But he always found me. He said no one would believe me if I told them, that I was worthless and unlovable." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she wiped them away quickly as if ashamed of showing weakness. Mark couldn't bear it anymore. Without thinking, he stood up and walked around the desk. Kneeling in front of her, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Emily," he said firmly, looking into her eyes, "you are not worthless. You are loved. And I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you before. But I'm here now, and I promise, I will do whatever it takes to protect you." For the first time, since walking into the office, Emily allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. She nodded slowly, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Okay." As they sat there together, the weight of the past pressing down on them, Mark vowed silently to make things right. He didn't know where to start or how to fix everything that had gone wrong, but one thing was clear. This was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. Over the next hour, Emily opened up more than she ever had before. Sitting across from Mark in his quiet office, she told him about the years of living in fear under her stepfather's roof. She described how he controlled every aspect of her life, what she wore, who she spoke to, even what she ate. If she disobeyed or made a mistake, the punishments were swift and brutal. Sometimes it was just yelling, but often it escalated to physical violence. The worst part, she confessed, was the isolation. Her stepfather forbade her from making friends or joining school activities, ensuring that no one outside their home would notice the signs of abuse. Mark listened intently, his heart breaking with each word. He couldn't imagine the strength it took for Emily to survive all those years alone. Yet despite everything, there was a resilience in her voice, a determination to break free from the chains that had bound her for so long. As she spoke, Mark noticed something else, a flicker of hope. For the first time in years, Emily wasn't just talking about pain. She was daring to dream of a future where she could be safe and loved. "I didn't know what else to do," Emily admitted, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. "After Mom died, I felt like I had no one left. But when I found those letters, they gave me hope. I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd want to help me." Mark reached out and placed a reassuring hand on hers. "Of course I want to help. You, he said firmly. You're my daughter, Emily. Nothing will change that. We'll figure this out together. Emily looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of doubt. When she saw only sincerity, she let out a shaky breath. Thank you, she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. I've been so scared for so long I didn't think anyone would care. Mark shook his head, his own throat tight with unshed tears. I care, Emily, more than you know, and I'm not going to let anyone hurt you anymore. He paused, thinking carefully about what needed to happen next. This wasn't just about offering comfort, it was about taking action. First things first, he said gently. We need to make sure you're safe. Do you have somewhere to stay right now? Somewhere your stepfather can't find you? Emily hesitated, then shook her head. No. He knows everywhere I go. That's why I came here. I figured he wouldn't expect it. Mark nodded, already formulating a plan. All right, here's what we're going to do. You can stay with me for now, at least until we sort everything out. My house is small, but it's safe, and I promise no one will lay a finger on you while you're there. Relief washed over Emily's face, though it was mixed with uncertainty. Are you sure? I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden, Mark interrupted firmly. You're family, and families take care of each other. Feeling a weight lift off her shoulders, Emily managed a small smile. It was the first genuine smile she'd shown since walking into the office, and it lit up her entire face. Mark felt a surge of pride and responsibility. This girl had been through hell, and now it was his job to guide her toward healing. As they discussed logistics, Mark promised to contact a lawyer the next day to explore legal options against her stepfather. He also suggested therapy, explaining the processing trauma would be an important part of moving forward. To his surprise, Emily didn't resist the idea. Instead, she nodded eagerly, saying, I just want to feel normal again. By the end of their conversation, Emily seemed lighter, as if sharing her story had lifted a piece of the heavy burden she'd carried for years. Mark walked her to his car, promising to keep her safe no matter what. As they drove to his house, Emily stared out the window, watching the world blur past. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was finally heading toward a place where she belonged. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for both Emily and Mark. After settling her into the spare bedroom at his house, Mark wasted no time in taking action. He contacted a lawyer named Ms. Carter, who specialized in cases involving domestic abuse and custody battles. When they met in Mark's living room the next day, Emily sat quietly on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, while Mark explained the situation. Ms. Carter listened intently, jotting down notes as she asked gentle but pointed questions. Emily, she said softly, turning her attention to the teenager, do you feel comfortable sharing what happened with me? It'll help us build a strong case against your stepfather. Emily hesitated, glancing at Mark for reassurance. He gave her an encouraging nod, silently promising he wouldn't leave her side. Taking a deep breath, Emily began recounting the years of torment, how her stepfather isolated her, belittled her, and eventually turned violent. Her voice wavered at times, but she pushed through, determined to tell the truth. By the end of her story, tears streamed down her face, but there was also a sense of relief, as if speaking the words out loud had loosened their grip on her soul. Ms. Carter assured them that they had a solid case. We'll file for an emergency, restraining order immediately, she explained. That should keep him away from you while we work on getting full legal protection. She also advised Mark to start the process of gaining formal custody of Emily. Though it would take time, having Mark officially recognized as her guardian would provide Emily with stability and safety. Later that week, Emily attended her first therapy session with Dr. Linda Hayes, a kind and patient counselor recommended by Mark. At first, Emily was hesitant, unsure of how talking about her feelings could possibly help. But Dr. Hayes had a calming presence, And within minutes, Emily found herself opening up about her fears, her loneliness, and the overwhelming guilt she carried for not standing up to her stepman sooner. "You're not responsible for his actions," Dr. Hayes reminded her gently during one particularly emotional session. "Abuse is never the victim's fault. What matters now is focusing on healing and rebuilding your life." Those words stuck with Emily long after the session ended. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe she wasn't broken beyond repair, that perhaps she deserved happiness after all. Back at home, Mark did everything he could to make Emily feel welcome. He cooked her favorite meals, once she admitted she liked spaghetti, played soft music in the evenings, and encouraged her to explore hobbies she used to enjoy before her stepfather took them away. One afternoon, he even brought home a sketch pad and colored pencils, remembering how Sarah used to love drawing. To his delight, Emily's face lit up when she saw the gift. "I haven't drawn in years," she confessed, flipping through the pages of the pad. But later that evening, Mark peeked into the living room to find her curled up on the couch, sketching a sunset with surprising skill. Watching her concentrate, completely absorbed in the moment, filled him with hope. This was progress, a small step toward reclaiming the pieces of herself she'd lost. Despite these positive changes, the road ahead wasn't easy. During one particularly grueling court hearing, Emily broke down on the stand as her stepfather's lawyer tried to twist her words, painting her as ungrateful and unstable. The memories came flooding back, threatening to drown her. But then she felt Mark's hand on her shoulder, grounding her. His steady voice whispered, "You're stronger than this, Emily. Keep going." With his support, she pushed through, finishing her testimony with quiet strength. When the judge granted the restraining order and ordered supervised visitation only, Emily felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Justice might not erase the scars, but it was a start. As they left the courthouse that day, Mark wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You did amazing," he told her proudly. "I'm so proud of you." Emily smiled faintly, leaning into him for comfort. For the first time, she realized she didn't have to face the world alone anymore. With Mark by her side, she felt ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead, one step at a time. As weeks turned into months, Emily began to settle into a rhythm at Mark's house. The spare bedroom, once plain and impersonal, slowly transformed into a space that felt like hers. She hung up drawings she'd made, landscapes, abstract patterns, and even a portrait of Mark, and added a few secondhand books to the small shelf in the corner. For the first time in years, she had a room where she could close the door and feel truly safe. Mark did everything he could to create a nurturing environment for her. He encouraged her to express herself, whether through art, journaling, or simply talking about her day. At dinner one evening, he surprised her by announcing they'd be signing up for a local community center class together, a pottery workshop. "It'll be fun," he said with a grin. "And who knows, maybe we'll discover hidden talents." Emily laughed nervously but agreed to give it a try. To her surprise, she enjoyed the tactile process of shaping clay with her hands. It was calming, almost therapeutic, and seeing Mark struggle comically with his own lopsided bowl only made the experience better. As they laughed together over their misshapen creations, Emily realized how much lighter she felt around him. Slowly but surely, trust was growing between them. Outside of their quiet moments at home, life continued to move forward. The legal battle against Emily's stepfather dragged on, but progress was being made. With Ms. Carter's guidance, Mark filed for full custody, presenting evidence of Emily's abuse and demonstrating his commitment to providing a stable home. Though the hearings were stressful, Emily found strength in knowing she wasn't facing them alone. Mark always sat beside her, holding her hand when she needed reassurance and reminding her to breathe when the tension became overwhelming. Therapy remained a cornerstone of Emily's healing journey. Dr. Hayes helped her unpack years of suppressed emotions, teaching her coping strategies to deal with anxiety and flashbacks. One breakthrough moment came during a session when Emily admitted she'd always blamed herself for not standing up to her stepfather sooner. Dr. Hayes gently challenged this belief, asking, "If someone you cared about went through what you did, would you blame them?" Emily shook her head immediately. No, I'd tell them it wasn't their fault. Then why do you hold yourself to a different standard? Dr. Hayes asked. That question lingered in Emily's mind long after the session ended. For the first time, she began to forgive herself, not completely, but enough to start letting go of some of the guilt that had weighed her down for so long. Meanwhile, Mark also found himself changing. Before Emily entered his life, he'd been content living quietly, dedicating himself to his work and hobbies. But now his days revolved around ensuring Emily felt loved and supported. He rediscovered parts of himself he'd neglected over the years, his passion for painting, his love of nature walks, and even his sense of humor. Watching Emily laugh at his terrible jokes reminded him of the joy he'd forgotten existed outside of routine. Their bond deepened further when Emily decided to share more about her mother. One rainy afternoon, she brought out a box of old photographs and mementos she'd kept hidden away. Together, they flipped through faded pictures of Sarah, young, vibrant, and full of life. Mark smiled fondly as Emily told stories about her mom, filling in gaps he hadn't known were missing. You look so much like her, he said softly, pointing to a photo of Sarah laughing on a beach. Same smile. Emily glanced at him, her eyes shining. Do you think she'd be happy about us finding each other? Mark didn't hesitate. I know she would. She loved you more than anything, Emily. And I like to think she'd be proud of how brave you've been. By the time spring rolled around, Emily had begun to blossom in ways neither of them expected. She enrolled in online classes to catch up on schoolwork, joined a local art group, and even started volunteering at an animal shelter, a cause close to her heart. Each new step brought her closer to reclaiming the pieces of herself she'd lost. Still, there were hard days. Nights when nightmares woke her in a cold sweat, or moments when self-doubt crept back in. But Mark was always there, ready with a listening ear or a warm hug. Together, they learned that healing wasn't linear. It was messy, unpredictable, and sometimes painful. But it was also beautiful because they were doing it side by side. As they sat together one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Emily leaned her head against Mark's shoulder. Thank you, she murmured, for everything. He kissed the top of her head, his voice soft but steady. Always, Emily, always. The turning point came on a crisp autumn morning when Emily received the news she'd been waiting for. The court had granted Mark full legal custody. It was official now. She was his daughter in every way that mattered. The weight of uncertainty lifted, and for the first time in years, Emily felt like she truly belonged somewhere. Mark celebrated the victory quietly but meaningfully. That evening, he prepared her favorite meal, spaghetti with garlic bread, and surprised her with a cake decorated simply with the words, "Welcome home." As they sat at the dining table, candles flickering softly between them, Emily couldn't help but smile. This feels real, she said softly, almost to herself. Like, I'm finally home. It is real, Mark replied firmly, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. And you're staying here, for good. But even as their lives began to stabilize, challenges remained. Emily still struggled with lingering fears and insecurities, especially when it came to trusting others. One day, while volunteering at the animal shelter, a kind older woman complimented her drawing skills and casually asked if she'd ever considered taking art classes. Though the comment was meant as encouragement, Emily froze, her mind flashing back to memories of her stepfather mocking her attempts at creativity. She mumbled an excuse and hurried away, leaving Mark worried when she returned home unusually quiet. Sensing something was wrong, he gently probed during dinner. What happened today? He asked, keeping his tone light. You seem off. Emily hesitated before explaining the incident. I don't know why it bothered me so much, she admitted, picking at her food. It's not like she did anything wrong, but it made me feel exposed, I guess. Mark nodded thoughtfully, understanding how deeply ingrained those old wounds were. It's okay to feel that way, he reassured her. He took away your confidence, but we can build it back together. You don't have to rush into anything you're not ready for. With Dr. Hayes's guidance, they worked on helping Emily recognize triggers and develop strategies to manage them. Over time, she grew more comfortable stepping out of her comfort zone. When another volunteer at the shelter invited her to join a weekend art fair, Emily surprised herself by saying yes. With Mark cheering her on from the sidelines, she set up a small display of her sketches and paintings. To her amazement, people loved her work, praising her talent and creativity. For the first time, Emily realized her voice, her art, had value. Meanwhile, Mark faced his own struggles. Guilt over missing 2 decades of Emily's life haunted him, especially on milestones like birthdays or holidays. On what would have been Emily's 16th birthday, he spent hours staring at old photos of Sarah, wondering what kind of father he might have been if circumstances had been different. Eventually, Emily found him sitting alone in his study, tears streaming silently down his face. "Hey," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "What's going on?" Mark hesitated before confessing his feelings. "I keep thinking about all the things I missed. The school plays, the scraped knees, the bedtime stories. What kind of dad does that make me?" Emily placed a hand on his arm, her expression earnest. "It doesn't make you any less of a dad," she told him. "You're here now, that's what matters, and honestly, you're doing pretty great." Her words brought him a measure of peace, reminding him that dwelling on the past wouldn't change it. Instead, he focused on making the most of the present and planning for the future. As winter approached, Emily decided to take another big step, reconnecting with her education. With Mark's support, she enrolled in a local high school program designed for students who needed flexible schedules. Her first day was nerve-wracking, but she quickly discovered that being around peers her age wasn't as daunting as she'd feared. Some kids teased her for being too quiet, but others went out of their way to include her. By the end of the semester, she'd formed a close friendship with a girl named Mia, who shared her love of art and animals. Through it all, Mark and Emily continued to lean on each other, weathering setbacks and celebrating victories together. They weren't just rebuilding their individual lives, they were building a family. And though scars remained, they carried them not as burdens but as reminders of how far they'd come. One chilly December evening, as they decorated the Christmas tree together, Emily turned to Mark with a warm smile. "Do you think Mom would be proud of us?" she asked. Mark paused, looking at the twinkling lights reflecting off her face. "I think she'd be amazed," he said honestly. "Because I am." Spring arrived, bringing with it a sense of renewal that mirrored the changes in Emily and Mark's lives. The days grew longer, warmer, and brighter, much like their outlook on the future. Emily had settled into her new routine at school, finding solace in her art classes and camaraderie with Mia, who became more than just a friend. She was a sister figure Emily never knew she needed. Together, they spent afternoons sketching in the park or brainstorming ideas for murals to submit to local contests. Mark noticed how much lighter Emily seemed now. She laughed more often, spoke up confidently during family dinners, and even started leaving her bedroom door open, a small but meaningful sign of trust. He couldn't help but feel proud every time he saw her face light up while talking about her dreams. Whether it was designing album covers or illustrating children's books, Emily's passion for art gave her a purpose she'd been missing for so long. One Saturday morning, as they sipped coffee together at the kitchen table, Emily hesitantly broached a topic that had been weighing on her mind. "Do you think I could maybe visit Mom's grave soon?" she asked, twisting the handle of her mug nervously. "I haven't been since before I came here." Mark set his cup down, giving her his full attention. "Of course," he replied, gently. "Whenever you're ready, we'll go together." A few weeks later, they drove to the quiet cemetery where Sarah was laid to rest. Emily clutched a bouquet of wildflowers in one hand as they walked along the gravel path, searching for the familiar headstone. When they found it, she knelt down, brushing away fallen leaves and placing the flowers carefully at the base. For a moment, she simply sat there, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. "I miss you, Mom," she whispered finally, her voice trembling. But I'm okay now, I promise. I've got Dad. He's helping me heal. Mark stood a few steps behind, giving her space but staying close enough to offer comfort if she needed it. Hearing her refer to him as Dad for the first time sent a wave of emotion through him, but he held it together, knowing this moment belonged to Emily. After a while, she stood up and turned to him, her eyes red but resolute. "Thank you for coming with me," she said softly. "I couldn't have done this alone." "You'll never have to do anything alone again," he promised, pulling her into a tight hug. Back home, Emily channeled her emotions into her art. Inspired by her visit to Sarah's grave, she began working on a mural titled Roots and Wings. It depicted a tree with deep roots growing toward the sky, its branches adorned with birds taking flight. To her, it symbolized resilience, the strength to hold on when life felt unbearable and the courage to move forward when it was time to let go. When the mural was complete, Emily entered it into a citywide youth art competition. On the day of the exhibit, Mark accompanied her, beaming with pride as they stood beside her work. To both their astonishment, the judges awarded her second place, praising the piece for its emotional depth and technical skill. As Emily accepted her ribbon, applause echoing around her, she glanced at Mark in the crowd and mouthed, "Thank you." That night, over celebratory pizza, Emily reflected on how far she'd come. "I used to think I'd never escape the past," she admitted. "But now I know it doesn't define me. I can still create something beautiful out of all the pain." Mark raised his glass of soda in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said with a smile. "And to you, Emily, you're proof that healing is possible." As spring melted into summer, their bond continued to deepen. They went on weekend hikes, explored farmers markets, and even adopted a scruffy rescue dog named Rusty, who quickly became part of the family. Each shared experience brought them closer, filling the gaps left by years apart. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the twilight, Emily leaned her head against Mark's shoulder. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if I hadn't walked into your office that day?" she asked quietly. Mark wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "All the time," he confessed. "But then I remind myself that I'm grateful for every single moment we've had since. You're my daughter, Emily. My life wouldn't be the same without you." In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of belonging and love, Emily realized she no longer feared the future. With Mark by her side, she knew she could face whatever lay ahead, not because the scars were gone, but because she'd learned to carry them with grace. The sun was setting on a warm summer evening as Emily and Mark strolled through the park, near their home. Rusty trotted happily beside them, his tail wagging furiously as he chased after butterflies. Children laughed nearby, their voices mingling with the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was one of those perfect moments that felt almost too good to be true. Emily glanced at Mark, who was smiling softly as he watched the scene unfold before them. She couldn't help but feel a swell of gratitude. For him, for this life they were building together, and for the quiet strength that had carried her through so much darkness. "Do you remember when I first walked into your office?" she asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Mark chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "How could I forget? You looked so small standing there, like the whole world was pressing down on you. But even then, I could see something special in you, something unbreakable." Emily smiled faintly, her gaze drifting toward the horizon painted in hues of orange and pink. "I didn't think I'd ever feel normal again," she admitted. "But now, being here with you, it feels like maybe I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm living." "That's all I ever wanted for you," Mark replied, his voice filled with emotion. "To see you happy, to watch you thrive. It means everything to me." They continued walking until they reached a bench overlooking a small pond. Ducks paddled lazily across the water, their reflections rippling gently in the golden light. Emily sat down, pulling her knees up to her chest as she thought about how far they'd come. Just over a year ago, she'd been trapped in a nightmare, convinced no one would ever care about her pain. Now she had a father who loved her fiercely, a dog who adored her unconditionally, and dreams that no longer felt out of reach. "Do you think people can really start over?" she asked after a while, her tone thoughtful. "Like, completely leave the past behind?" Mark considered her question carefully before answering. "I don't think we ever fully leave the past behind," he said slowly. "But I do believe we can choose how it shapes us. The scars will always be there. They're part of our story. But they don't have to control us. What matters is what we build from here." Emily nodded, absorbing his words. She thought about the mural she'd created, Roots and Wings, and how it represented her journey. The roots symbolized the foundation she'd found in Mark, and the love that anchored her, while the wings stood for the freedom she'd discovered within herself. Together, they reminded her that healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about growing stronger. As twilight settled in, casting long shadows across the park, Emily turned to Mark with a determined look in her eyes. "I want to go back to school in the fall," she announced. "For real this time, not just online classes. I want to finish high school and maybe even apply to art school someday." Mark's face lit up with pride. "That's incredible, Emily. I know you'll do amazing things. I couldn't have done any of this without you," she added quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved me, Dad. Not just from him, but from myself." Tears welled up in Mark's eyes as he pulled her into a tight hug. "No, sweetheart," he whispered. "You saved yourself. I just gave you a place to land." For a long moment they sat there together, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. Rusty curled up at their feet, content and safe. As the world grew quieter around them, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of peace, a feeling she hadn't known was possible until now. Life wouldn't always be easy. They both knew that. There would still be hard days ahead, moments when old fears resurfaced or doubts crept in. But neither of them was afraid anymore. Not of the challenges, not of the unknown. They had each other, and that was enough. As they walked home under the glow of streetlights hand in hand, Emily realized something important. Family wasn't just about blood. It was about the connections you chose to nurture, the love you gave freely, and the promises you kept. And in Mark, she had found all of that, and more. When they reached the front porch, Emily paused, looking back at the night sky one last time. "We made it," she murmured softly, almost to herself. Mark smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Yeah, we did," he agreed. "And whatever comes next, we'll face it together." With that, they stepped inside, closing the door behind them. The house was warm and welcoming, filled with laughter, memories, and hope. For the first time in a long time, Emily truly believed she was exactly where she was meant to be. And as she drifted off to sleep that night, surrounded by love, she knew the best chapters of her story were yet to come.